Hello everybody, my name is Kat and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things horror. And today we are doing another horror book review. I love doing these videos. Admittedly, I haven't been able to read as many books as I would like to, just because, you know, life, work. But I do have about 6 books that I'm going to be talking about and giving my reviews of today. I did do a video similar to this back in the summer, so if you're someone that really loves watching book reviews, I'll leave a link to that somewhere up here or down below. Let's get into it. So the first book that I'm going to talk about is Tender is the Flesh. This is written by Augustina Bazterrica. I think that's how you say her last name. I had to look up how to say her last name and write it down before filming this video, because if you've watched my videos before, you know that I'm terrible with pronouncing names. She is an author from Argentina. Overall, I would say that this was one of my favorites that I've read in the past few months. I actually found the reading of it to be quite awful, not because of the story or because the writing is bad. The writing is actually really good. It's that kind of writing that just immerses you into the world, and the world that she's creating here is not a pleasant one. So this is a book that takes place in a dystopian-like future, in which it has suddenly become dangerous to interact with and especially consume animals. Something has happened in which animals now pose a threat to human existence. They make humans sick, and a simple interaction with an animal is considered like a huge risk. Like, the book describes how people, they don't really walk around outside because they're afraid of the birds, and if they do walk around outside, they're like carrying these umbrellas. There's this whole fear of being outside and birds like pooping on you. That has happened to me, and it is an unpleasant experience, so like I kind of get it. But most importantly, humans cannot consume animal meat, so obviously this creates a great strain on the food system, not just in Argentina but around the whole world. And basically the world leaders gather together and create this system in which they make it legal for people to consume human meat. So this is a dystopian world in which cannibalism is legal and fine and just part of the everyday reality. So similar to cattle, you now have humans that are being bred specifically to be food. They're stripped of any dignity. They are not allowed to have any kind of identity. Their only purpose in life is to be food and feed, most often than not, the higher class, the upper echelon of society that is able to pay for this kind of expensive meat. And our protagonist, Marcos, works for one of these companies that breeds and then slaughters humans for food. And you can tell that this is a job that just weighs on him very heavily. He also is dealing with the fact that his wife is not with him. She is in a mental institution. You find out in the story that they were trying to have a child together. She did get pregnant. She did have a successful birth, but then they ultimately lost the child. So he's also a very lonely character in that respect. And there's a lot of internal struggle of him just thinking about his wife and his son, and also his dad, who is suffering from, I believe, a form of Alzheimer's. So he's a very lonely person, and he does spend a lot of time thinking about the past and thinking about the way the world was before all of this chaos happened. And then one day he is gifted this young woman who is one of these beings that is meant to be slaughtered. He's gifted her to, you know, do whatever he wants. He can either cook her for food or he can sell her to the highest bidder. But he ends up keeping her in his house, and I think he's very charmed by her vulnerability and her very childlike qualities. And so he starts taking care of her and creating a bond with her, which is a big no-no in this society, because it's very much set up that humans that are bred for food, you cannot have any kind of bonds or human relationships with them. You can't think of them like humans. You have to think of them like food. So he's definitely risking his own life by taking care of her. Again, this book is really well written. She really creates these very visceral scenes. She brings you into scenes of these meat plants, and yeah, just the descriptions of it, like you can just see it, right? Like the humans on the conveyor belt, and the smells, the mixture of like the blood and the chemicals, the sounds of them beating and killing these humans and ripping them apart in order to take out all of their organs to be sold. Like, it's just like, oh. It's a very unpleasant read. And again, I'm saying that as a compliment to her writing because obviously that's what she was going for here. There were times when I was reading this and I was like, this is disgusting. I don't want to be in this world anymore. But I was also so intrigued by what was going to happen next that I just kept pushing through. Ultimately, this is a very provocative read, and so if you're someone that's into the like extreme horror literature, you probably have already heard of this book, you might have already read it, but if you're someone that is looking for something within that kind of genre, I think this would be a good pick. And I think it explores a lot of interesting themes without needing to bash you over the head with like, this is what the story is about. Obviously, there's a lot of connections here between humans' need to overconsume, this habit of overconsumption that we have, and how that is very much linked to capitalism, and kind of posing this whole question like, if we just keep consuming and consuming and consuming with no limits, what's going to happen when we drain the world's resources? Obviously, you can make themes here about the treatment of the animals that we do eat, the concern around how cattle or chickens or whatever food that we're eating, how it is treated. I think you could also pull in something like climate change, right? And which again, connecting to this overconsumption that we have in society. And you know, right now we take it for granted that we can just like go outside and enjoy the world. But if our climate was to ever change to a point where it would become dangerous for us to go out and enjoy nature and interact with nature, what kind of life would that be? The way that she's describing it here, it sounds pretty awful. There's also something in here too that she mentions briefly around things like media and government control. There is certain questions that pop up around whether or not this danger that animals pose to humans is really as bad as the media and government make it seem, or if again this is all something that's kind of constructed because people in power are trying to keep their positions of power interesting and relevant to the times. I'm not gonna spoil anything in this book, but I'll just say like the ending took me by such a surprise, and I don't even know why, because thinking back to everything that she sets up in the beginning of the book, it's like, well yeah, this was going to be the only conclusion, but it did not go where I was expecting or perhaps hoping that it would go. It's a pretty bleak story. It's a very cynical book. When I first saw the cover of this, I thought this was like devil horns, and like it's not. Clearly it's supposed to be like cattle, signify that humans are food in this world, but I think the devil horns could still work because she does create a vision of hell. And I will just give a content warning, a trigger warning as well. There are some scenes in here of animal abuse that are particularly difficult to read and get through. There's a scene that takes place at a zoo with a litter of puppies that was just like the worst thing I've had to read, and she does not shy away from describing that. Something to keep in mind if you are interested in reading this. So the next book that I'm going to talk about is actually by the same author, 19 Claws and a Blackbird. This is a collection of short stories that she's written, each dealing with a variety of different topics. You've got serial killers in here, you've got weird monstrous creatures that come out of people's body parts. As with any anthology series, you know, there are hits and misses. There's some stories in here that I really like, others that I was kind of lukewarm about, but overall I really enjoyed this collection and had a lot of fun with some of these stories. Very similar to Tender is the Flesh, the writing in here is so visceral and descriptive, really disgusting in some parts. And what I admire too about this work in particular is the way that she's able to craft these very visually descriptive worlds in so few words. She'll just weave together like these two sentences that just create this feeling inside of you. She just creates these hellscapes with so little words, and it's very impressive. For example, first story is called A Light, Swift, and Monstrous Sound. This was one of my favorites and is essentially about this woman who goes out on her porch on New Year's Day, right? And it's New Year's Day. That's supposed to be symbolic of new beginnings. It's supposed to be an exciting time. She goes out on her patio and this set of dentures, right, like these fake teeth fall by her feet, and so she just kind of like moves to look at it, and then suddenly her neighbor upstairs that lives above her catapults himself off of his balcony and falls on her patio and kills himself. And so the rest of the story is basically her just staring at this dead body and kind of going through this whole mental loop about this is like a bad sign to start off your new year. I think the other thing too that she does really well with this book is that she's often using second person perspective when describing the stories. She's she's referring to the reader as you, right? She's basically putting you as the reader into the role of the protagonist. So for example, like in this first story, she says, "You felt that people like you didn't deserve this. Courteous people, professional people, people with their lives together and in order, people you considered to be good because you were an exemplary person. Your values were in the right place and you were destined for success. That Menendez's repugnant naked body was an omen at the start of your year, a sign from the heavens, was simply unacceptable." Again, using the second person perspective to really immerse you in the world. One of my other favorite stories in here is called Candy Pink, which is basically about this woman who is going through this breakup and is, caught up in all the emotions of a breakup. What I love about it is the way that she sets it up is she's basically writing it as like a step-by-step guide of grieving a horrible breakup, right? And dealing with all of these intense, crazy emotions. So for example, she says like, "Step 1, observe the tears falling on your fingers. Think of diamonds. Picture Elizabeth Taylor. Long for violet eyes and successive husbands. Mistake, backtrack. You don't need more men in your life." So just like fun writing like that, and I feel like a story like that really does capture these kind of crazy heightened emotions that you feel when going through a breakup or any kind of separation. So it felt very relatable. I will say many of the stories in here don't really have what you would call happy endings. Kind of like Tender is the Flesh, it is a bit of a cynical book. And I will give like another trigger warning here. She is dealing with things like taking one's life. You have a couple stories in here that involve children, young girls, and really creepy predatory men. And again, she's not shying away from anything or any of the descriptions here. So just a content warning for that. Again, I would say this is something, if you're more of a fan of the extreme graphic horror literature, probably pick this one up. But I'll just conclude by saying that I really appreciate that she is willing to talk about some of these subjects. This is just a personal thing for me, but I always love it when you have a woman writer or filmmaker that is not afraid to dive into the taboo and explore the very grotesque aspects of human nature. I was trying to think of like who's a female filmmaker that she reminds me of, and the one person that came to mind immediately is Coralie Forjat, who is the director of The Substance and also Revenge. But again, another like female creator that is not afraid to just put it all out there and explore the very violent, the very subversive. I really appreciate that about her writing. The next book that I'm going to talk about is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This is one that I picked out while just looking through the aisles of Barnes & Noble one day. I really loved the cover of it that has such like beautiful artwork. And essentially what this is a retelling or reimagining of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. Except in this story, what is plaguing the Ushers, what is haunting them, is actually this fungal infection that they get from the local water source and just this fungus that is growing in the environment around them, and is essentially turning the sister and all of the animals around the area into these zombified like creatures. So this is essentially Edgar Allan Poe meets The Last of Us. I will say this was not necessarily my favorite of all the books that I read, not because I thought the writing was bad or that the story was bad. I just think when I was reading it, I was looking for maybe something a little bit different than what this is. I'll say too, like I'm not necessarily always the biggest fan of straight retellings, especially reading it so soon after seeing like the Mike Flanagan series, for example. I guess for me, what I find more interesting is when you can take something like a Poe story or a Lovecraft story and extract the themes and then putting those themes within a contemporary narrative. That's what I tend to find more interesting, because I feel like we get a lot of books and films and TV shows that always want to go back to the past. I just kind of crave more contemporary stories in that sense. Again, I don't think this is a bad book, and I think it will definitely have its fans, and I think there's definitely people that will enjoy this kind of story. It feels like a very cozy book, and you have that kind of vintage feel to it. It's taking place in this grand mansion, castle-like environment. And so there's a lot of scenes of characters, right, just kind of wandering through the house and down the dark shadows, and it's creaking and there's candlelights everywhere, right? Like that's the imagery that it's evoking. So if you're looking for something that has a bit more of a cozy feel to it, that is not that graphic, that is not that violent, that does have some eeriness to it, but is not over the top gory or dealing with very upsetting subjects like the last two books that I talked about. This, like, I don't think this is a book that's going to keep you up at night. That being said, I do think there are some effective scenes in this book, you know, especially when you do get to the stuff with like the fungal infections and how it's creating these zombie creatures. That aspect of the book is probably what I found the most interesting. I also love too, there is the inclusion of this female scientist character who just pops up around the estate and is essentially studying the fungal growth of the environment, and her name is Eugenia Potter, and it is heavily hinted that she is the aunt of Beatrix Potter, the children's author. And I was such a huge Beatrix Potter fan growing up. Like, I loved those stories, so I thought it was cute that she had that inclusion in here. So again, a very atmospheric book, and again, it's super short. This is only like 157 pages. Like, I got through it in 2 days. And yeah, even though this wasn't necessarily my favorite, I'm still interested in reading T. Kingfisher's other work. So the next book that I talked about is one that I actually don't have here with me because I had to bring it back to the library. This is a book that has been around for quite a while now, but I just read it recently, and that is Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. Yes, I have not read this book prior. I have seen the movie. Obviously, the film is iconic. So I was actually really excited to dive into this one. This was a book that the book club I'm a part of, the members chose this one for our October reading. We wanted to read something that was classic. I went into it kind of thinking, okay, it's Anne Rice, it's going to be fun, it's going to be sexy, it's vampires. And then I was surprised to find that it wasn't that fun or that sexy. It's funny because when my book club did meet about this, many people either DNF'd it or they just kind of complained that the characters of Lestat and Louis and Claudia were just really whiny and annoying. And like, here's the thing, I don't necessarily disagree with them, because while I was reading the book, like, I did find the characters kind of annoying, especially Louis. However, I do disagree with my book club that overall the book was boring. There was a point where it did hook me in and I realized what it is that Anne Rice was trying to explore with this, and after that, like, it completely changed my view of the whole book, and I really enjoyed it and I really appreciated it. This is a book that I would consider going back to again at some point. It's not like the sexy vampires that we would see in some of Anne Rice's other works, or I think my book club was going into this expecting it to be something like True Blood. I really enjoyed a lot of the philosophical themes, and again, all these questions around morality and living forever. And I think what was so interesting is that we as humans have this innate fear of our morality. This idea of living forever is a very appealing idea. What Anne Rice is exploring with Interview with the Vampire that's really interesting is this idea that while morality can be scary, there's also something very freeing about it as well, in the sense that if you know you have a finite amount of time to live, that's what gives things meaning, right? Suddenly your life has a meaning and a purpose. And I think what she's exploring here with these vampires who just live forever, yes, they have all of these riches, they have eternal life, they have access to things like great art, but it all feels so meaningless to them because, again, they just always have access to it. And there isn't that fear of impermanence. Things just kind of lose their meaning in life, right? It all just kind of becomes dull and monotonous. Usually our purpose, you know, it comes from a sense of like, okay, I'm going to die one day, so I want to make sure that I get all of these things done that I want to do. You have the vampires that they meet in Paris, I think it is, and Louis and Claudia find these other vampires and think like, okay, we're finally going to understand the meaning of our existence. And no, like, these vampires just like sit around and are so caught up in just like the dumbest things, or there is no meaning to their life when they can just like live forever. So I found these questions around morality really interesting, and I know that she did write this book as a way to deal with the grief of losing her young daughter, and I guess this might be her way of trying to make some sense or meaning of morality and death and why does this exist. So yes, really enjoyed Interview with the Vampire. Am I the only one that's spent their whole life thinking the title was Interview with a Vampire. Like, I got the book and I was like, oh, it's called Interview with the Vampire, but the film is called Interview with a Vampire. And then I looked it up and no. That was like a weird, I don't know, mandala effect. Reading it made me really interested in seeing the AMC series adaptation. If you've seen that and it's worth checking out, let me know. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Dark Harvest. Now, this is one that has been recommended to me for a while now, and anytime anyone has recommended it to me, they've all said something along the lines of how it's very much evokes the feelings of October and autumn, and it's just a great spooky read. And yeah, it's a fun book. I don't think I like it as much as other people do. I know a lot of people really do love this book. When I was going into it, I was really expecting it to evoke more of the fall season in all of the senses. Not to say that it doesn't. Like, there are descriptions in here that do feel very fall-like, right? The descriptions of the cornfields, for example. I guess maybe I was expecting more like Halloween vibes. It's taking place on Halloween night, but this is obviously a very different Halloween night because this is all about a town that is haunted by this entity every year known as the October Boy. And this entity goes around and terrorizes the town, and then you have all the young men in the town who have to go out and hunt the October Boy. I feel like I really enjoyed like the first two parts of it, and then the third part kind of felt like it dragged for me a little bit. You know, it's one of these books in which you have characters that you're just kind of like walking around town, and you have characters that meet up and they'll talk about something, or you'll have scenes in which you're with, you know, one of the town parents, for example, and they're sitting in a church and you're just kind of getting what they're thinking about and their backstory that led them to this moment. You're getting scenes of the October Boy who is just walking around town. It's one of those books where you're just kind of hanging with the characters and getting a lot of their backstories, a lot of flashbacks. There's not so much here in terms of a lot of action or any kind of goriness. I think I just kind of went into it expecting it to be something a bit different than what it actually is. And what's funny is that for as much time as you are spending with the characters, I would say the character development is pretty at a minimum. I mean, this is another like really short book. I do think the author does a good job of giving it this kind of campfire feel story, right? Like you're sitting around a campfire and people are telling like urban legends or old folklore from their small town. And I know that's the vibes that he was going for, so I do think he succeeds in that. This feels like it would make a really good episode of an anthology series, like Are You Afraid of the Dark? Or, you know, that like Ray Bradbury series. What was it? Ray Bradbury Presents. Like, it has that vibe to it. And this is another book that also tends to use the second person perspective a lot to, again, kind of bring you as the reader into the story. He starts off the book with a Midwestern town. You know its name. You were born there. It's Halloween 1963 and getting on toward dark. Things are the same as they've always been. There's the main street, the old brick church in the town square, the movie theater, this year with a Vincent Price double bill, and past all that is the road that leads out of town. It's black as a licorice whip under an October sky, black as the night that's coming and the long winter nights that will follow. So descriptions like that are a lot of fun. I think this is a really good, quick, seasonal read. This is another one where if you're someone that's interested in reading something with a spooky vibe to it, but you don't want it to like creep you out or give you nightmares, I would say probably check out Dark Harvest. I might go back to this at a later time. I have not seen the film that they made of this, nor have I heard great things about it, but if you've seen it and you think I should check it out, let me know. And then the final book that I'm going to talk about is Nightbitch by Rachel Yoder. I got this book mainly because there is a film adaptation coming out, I think at the end of the year, starring Amy Adams. And I was like, okay, well, I'll probably see the film and do a review on it, so why don't I just read the book and then I can do a comparison of them. And you know, I was kind of intrigued by the story of this stay-at-home mom who, dealing with all the pressures of motherhood and all the anxieties and frustrations that come with that, how that manifests in this character becoming this creature. Now, I went into this thinking that this was going to be a werewolf story, and it's not. The protagonist here does not turn into a werewolf, she just turns into a dog. But yes, you do have this protagonist who is this mother. She has a toddler she's trying to raise. The husband husband isn't in the picture a lot. He's always leaving and going out of town for work and only comes back home on the weekends. So she has to take care of all of the child rearing by herself and doesn't have a lot of time for herself. And then what you learn is that she is also an artist. She's like a multimedia artist, I believe, that basically had to give up her career to stay at home. And this is kind of driving her crazy. All of these feelings create this sense of mania in her, and that manifests in her turning into this dog. This kind of reminded me of something like Mona Awad's Bunny. Like, this kind of feels like the suburban stay-at-home mom version of Bunny, although not as good as that book, I would say. While Bunny, I feel like, had a certain charm to it and a certain comedic tone to it, and I think was very much being a critique on some of the topics that it was bringing up. I felt like Nightbitch took itself like a little bit too seriously at times. If you look at the trailer does definitely have more of a comedic feel to it, which I think is smart. I think that's actually the better way to go with a story like this. I didn't really get that from the book. Like, there were some comedic moments here and there, and I guess I was thinking it was going to build up into something greater than what it actually did. It's like you have this 300-page plus book that's building up to this woman who's transforming and turning into this dog, and you're just kind of waiting for that moment where she does something really terrible, or her husband finds out about it and he's creeped out and maybe she has to like kill him. That's the kind of horror I was waiting for, and the book doesn't really give you that. I don't even know if I would like call this a horror book. There's not anything in here that's particularly grotesque or using any like the horror tropes. Again, we're not having werewolves here. If anything, it's just kind of annoying. I just found the protagonist to be really whiny. I don't want to dismiss how difficult and hard it is to be a parent. I am not a parent myself, but I know people who are parents, and I know that you do have to make sacrifices to raise a child, right? And I've seen this of both mothers and fathers. In our current society, we still do have this belief that women are the primary caregivers, not denying that that is not still a truth. I guess just like reading the book, it just kind of felt like the protagonist, like her predicament is one that she's willingly putting herself in. There are times throughout the book where she's complaining that her husband is always leaving and going to work and she has to stay at home. And it's like, well, have you ever like tried talking to your husband about this? Like, there is a scene towards the end of the book where she just flat out tells him, you're going to do the bedtime routine the nights that you're home. I have to do it every day of the week. So now that you're home on the weekends, that's going to be your responsibility. And he's just like, yeah, okay. And then she has a moment where she was like, oh wow, that was kind of easy. Why didn't you just do that before? Like, why didn't you have an actual conversation with your spouse about how you were feeling? So just one of those things where it feels like the protagonist is purposefully putting herself in this mental spiral. I just don't like reading these kinds of like passive characters. And also, like, let's be real here, the protagonist in this is a privileged middle-class white woman. Her husband literally takes care of all of the expenses for her. She doesn't have to worry about money or where her next meal is coming from. I know mothers who are working full-time jobs, sometimes 2 jobs, to make ends meet and provide for their child. Again, I just feel like we have a character that is just being very passive and just not taking any kind of initiative. In some ways that can be very relatable, and I've definitely found myself in these spirals as well. But to just have to sit there for 300 plus pages and listen to this woman whining and complaining and not much is happening besides that. You get very few scenes of her actually turning into a dog. Like, I just found it kind of a slog to get through. And I feel like while Bunny, you know, I know not everyone is a fan of that book, but I guess what I enjoyed about it is these themes and the critiques that it's making about class and privilege, the way that it's dealing with themes around identity and this basic human need that we all have to fit in, and the lengths that we will go to try to feel like we fit in somewhere. And I think it also brings up this really interesting tension around femininity, where on the one hand, it's very much celebrating extreme femininity in terms of everything's pink and it's sparkles and it's unicorns and rainbows. And that feels very inviting and very appealing. And there is something that feels empowering about the female characters in that book that can just embrace that side of themselves and not care that other people might think it's stupid or frivolous. And on the other hand, also pointing out how engaging in that can sometimes perpetuate negative stereotypes about femininity, or what the ideal feminine being should be and look like and be interested in. So I thought there was like a really interesting tension in Bunny that was exploring all of these themes, whereas because I just don't get any of that in Nightbitch. Like, I don't know what Nightbitch was really trying to say, other than motherhood is hard and women are unfairly burdened with having to do a lot of the child rearing a lot of the time. Yes, there's a truth in reality, but we have other stories that explore these topics, and I think much more interesting ways. I think also too, what annoyed me about this book is there's an aspect to it that likes to indulge in this fantasy around women being innately connected to nature and, you know, having this like wild feminine side to them where they just want to run out into the woods naked and just like run around and howl at the moon. Like the protagonist in here finds this book that's basically a field guide about magical women, or women that live out in nature and take on these like animal forms. So I feel like it likes to indulge in that fantasy, which I'm personally not a big fan of. I actually did my whole doctoral dissertation talking about this, specifically within like horror cinema, and yeah, just this kind of trope of women being connected to nature because of their ability to procreate, and the different ways that is explored within pop culture and especially within horror cinema. You have these two dichotomies where women and nature, and women who live in nature, the wild woman, is either scary and terrifying, or it's this very fantastical, essentialized version of femininity. So yes, I understand the appeal of being a woman and wanting to run out into the woods and just be wild and crazy. I also recognize how these ideas just can perpetuate the gender stereotypes that a book like this is claiming to want to be against or want to critique. So yeah, I was not into this book. I'm hoping the movie will be better. I really like Amy Adams. We'll see what happens with that. So that's it. That is all of the horror books that I have been reading lately. I do have 2 other books here that I'm going to be reading for the Christmas season coming up. Grim Curiosities, which I saw a couple of people talking about online, and I just really liked the description of it. It's 1851 in Old York. Lizzie Grimm struggles to save her late father's charmingly creepy yet floundering antique shop, Grim Curiosities. Then, during a particularly snowy December in the most haunted city in England, things turn curiouser. I just like the description of it, and I was like, yeah, England in December sounds like a fun place to be transported into. And the description of it with like the Grim Curiosities very much reminded me of that film Oddity that came out this year that I really liked a lot. It was one of my favorites of the year. And then I also have Christmas and Other Horrors, which is an anthology book of several short stories for the Yuletide season. Have you read any of the books that I have talked about here? If so, what were your thoughts on them? Let me know in the comments down below. Let me know what you've been reading lately. If you have any recommendations for something that I should check out, please let me know, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching.